This chat is a free-flowing conversation between you, Max, and Shaka, exercising spiritual curiosity and the Socratic method to explore boundaries, definitions, and differing perspectives. We will dissolve the MF, that is the masculine-feminine understanding, and tune you into the healing center of the world, that is Costa Rica. The show starts with a few questions to dive into and really stir you up. It soon takes you into a free-flowing conversation, and the last quarter of the show is open to relational or well-being dilemma and advice from the show's hosts to you. Sorry.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the motherfucking podcast. We are here with beautiful Shaka and myself. And today we have a lovely, lovely episode for you. And we're really kind of bringing this whole story around and this framework into not only the masculine and the feminine dynamic, but the shadow and the light, seeing how they dance, but really creating what this podcast is really about and explaining this quadrant. And it's basically a structure. A lot of it is based on psychology, you know, whether you believe in Jungian theory, whether you believe in mysticism, whether you believe in bodyism, whatever all the isms are. We really want to create this balance and this really understanding to create a wholeness that is embodied. So today we're going to be comparing the world of mysticism as well as the world of Jungian theory. And this is really just a concept of cognitive archetypes. Not 100% based in Jungian theory, but we're going to use that as a foundation and really create a, what did we call it? A mystigration, kind of like an integration of mysticism and cognition. So we want to break down and really look at all of these different facets of not only the cognitive, but also how they show up in the arcana. Is that different than like the tarot?
Yeah. Well, you have the major arcana and the minor arcana, and that forms the whole of the tarot.
Okay.
The whole of,
so perfect. Yeah. So you know who's coming with the mysticism on this side. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoy this, and this is really a concept that has come up, and I want to really bring in this flow because like we've had continuous talks about you know, like Jungian theory and also like mysticism. I practice a little magic too, and I have a general idea of like, I guess, tarot in a way, not necessarily arcana. The only arcana like information I have is like that Pokemon that was named like Arcane or Canine or something like that. So give us a little bit of insight into what this arcana is and like how it shows up for you in the archetypes, because I'm super interested in that.
Sure. So you have like the major arcana, which is basically the archetypal journey. It starts with the Fool. The Fool is number 0, so that's just pure potentiality. It's just pure. Maybe even think about it like a newborn baby. Like you don't know what the whole life of this.
Damn fools.
Like
I knew it.
Yeah, and it's like, and I guess the Fool is unencumbered by past, you know, baggage. He's got very small bag on, like he carries. Generally, this is like the traditional like Rider Waite, and then there's a whole journey that forms, which is basically the major arcana. That forms the major arcana, and that's essentially the like the hero's journey to some extent. And then you have the minor arcana, which is like they call the pip cards, which is very much related to like playing cards. So you've got 4 suits, 4 elements. They're related to the 4 elements, and so these are kind of the stories, like general kind of human stories. And depending on how these cards come out in a spread, will tell you, like about your life, your story, sometimes your future, but not always. Depends how you pull the cards, what's your intention and things like that. But that's how we use the cards.
Okay. So there's basically like 2 levels to it, and in the minor you have like what I would consider is like, you know, the platonic solids, and like how you would see sacred geometry is, you know, the physical plane, the mental plane, the causal plane. So we'll kind of like bridge that connection. Like that's in a way that I see. I'm kind of like structuring it in my mind.
Yeah.
But also you said that there's the major arcana, which is how many is from the Fool to
Well, it's 22 cards
the Sun, right?
To the world.
To the world.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So you said 22.
It's 22 cards altogether, but the Fool is 0. So
okay.
it like he's
like 23.
So it's no, because it's 1 to 22.
And then the 0.
Yes.
So 23.
23 altogether. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
All right. So then you have this major arcana.
Yes.
And then those are, I guess, they have their own archetypes that are in like each card.
Absolutely.
And okay, cool. So,
and sometimes they relate. So sometimes I sometimes connect some of the majors to the minors, and sometimes I would like how I read. Sometimes is I feel like major arcanas are like divine forces working in your life. Sometimes like fate, things that you don't necessarily have a choice over, things that are gonna that kind of not necessarily happen to you, but things that are like happening, and that's kind of coming from outside of you. And then the minor arcanas might be like our choice points, that's sometimes how not always, but generally how I might interpret the mix of majors and minors on a board. So so if you've got like a spread and there's loads of majors, like it's a major times, things are happening. That's a big themes. Whereas if you have a spread and it's all minor arcana, it's kind of like, okay, it's life. Life is lifing, but it's, depending on what's on the board, it's,
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, I feel like how this kind of bridges, because even like in the Jungian theory, when we're talking about the cognitive mindset, the way I'm seeing it is like, I always see, like spirit on this wider, more broad spectrum. And then as it comes down, it gets denser and it's like into the body. And like, this is really what we want to like break down is like the practicality of that. And like coming from that, the major and minor arcana and those different aspects that are up there and how we can like relate to them. Like sometimes, I mean, I definitely like want to identify all the cards and like just get like a little brief kind of like insight to them and then connect that to this Jungian theory of like what the past is and also like how we want to bring that, because these are, I mean, I've gotten some, like I definitely like pull cards once in a while when I'm looking for like that outer, more broad causal plane kind of like message to come through. And for me, that's helped just in the masculine sense, like develop my intuition. And it deals with a lot of like higher faculties. And this for me as a practice is knowing and understanding these archetypes within the cognition that Jungian has studied, Freud, you have physics, you have metaphysics, you have all these different things, psychology, that are based on these archetypes and like how they show up and present into our life. But really what we want to construct here, or like deconstruct, well, at least that's my intention to do, is really dissolve this like linearism, that we're not individuals solely, like on that other level, we are connected causally, we are connected collectively, we are connected universally. So this is where I feel like this bridge into this mysticism and this bridge into this cognitive like concept can help to start to show and also give more insight into how we are presenting with issues, with problems. We're dealing with our shadow, dealing with our persona, dealing with our partners, dealing with our relationships, business, all of these different things, because it's ultimately us, and we're in control of our world, we're in control of our emotions, and that's ultimately what we're looking to give here is this masculine and feminine empowerment in that way, because when we're looking at this concept of, cognition, and then we also have this mysticism, if we're not bridging or harmonizing this spirit and this mind, then how can the body ever function? And like a lot of times I feel that whether if it's clients, whether it's friends, or even myself, the body has like this, we're functioning on this dense plane, and like we're dealing with all these issues with, why do these patterns keep showing up? Why am I attracting this type of person? Why am I dealing with this emotional trigger? And it's like, once we start to organize that mind and that mysticism and basically our spirit, we can kind of bring together that empowerment and really get that divine sense of like what you always speak about is this like intuition, and really making it work. So for me, and guys, I feel like you can 100% like get on board with this is a part of the exercise, you know. For me is like to get this insight as what you're saying. And I think to kind of start off, feel like, yeah, like explain some of the major arcanas like as they go through.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess I would say just kind of picking up what you said, like using all of these different tools. Like I'm really like a big believer that like the psychic or mystical practices, whether that be, you know, psychic, you know, just psychic work generally, mediumship and tarot, without actually the context of psychology, it's actually very incomplete, I would say. And vice versa. I feel like when we're studying the mind in a more kind of, say, like scientific way, without the mysticism, it's incomplete. So I think that's why Jung proved so popular, because he kind of had a foot in both worlds. He was very interesting, kind of brought them together, arguably.
Yeah, I don't personally believe that, but we're gonna go with that. We're gonna go with that. Just because he said that like dreams are important, that's not really like mysticism. Me as like a black man, and like in my spirit, I'm like, that's not enough for me. Like I need the magic. You know
I mean,
what I'm
wasn't it like his aunt? Was it to be like he was his aunt? Was it his aunt or his parents? Or he grew up in like a house with like there was all like kind of ghosts and things like that. So he grew up like with mediums. Like he grew up basically. He was really interested in.
Grew up with ghosts too. What you talk about? I'm about that life. I feel it. Like I understand that, and I see that he was. He definitely played a little bit into it. I just feel like he ain't leave the back door open for nobody. You know what I'm saying? So this is what we're here to do. I'm here to leave the back door open for all of y'all. So yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah. So yeah, the story of the major arcana starts with the Fool, which is just pure potentiality, pure. You know, what might this journey bring? What is the next phase, the next chapter? Like, and it's just pure unknown, and it's a very exciting positive card, even though it is called the Fool. People, it's not really, it doesn't talk like, it's not necessarily that person is a fool, but I guess we do think of the person as a fool because they're just about to jump off a cliff, and they're going in just jumping off a cliff. They're like, yeah, let's go. And there's something so beautiful about that. There's something so innocent about like just basically giving yourself over to life. And I suppose that like again like speaks to like a very initiatory energy. When you don't know what's involved, you're not encumbered with like, oh, but what if that happens? Well, what if that happens? Oh, well, what if that? You know, you're not encumbered with that. You're just you're just literally open to like, wow, what could possibly be? And it's an incredibly beautiful positive card. And that culminates with the World, which is a completion. It's a kind of cycle has finished. It's a chapter that's closed. And then there's a whole journey, obviously, in between. And in my, how I read the cards anyway, that for me is about spiritual maturation. The cards are speaking about, the first 10 really are kind of talking about kind of the earthly plane. It's like kind of, right, you know, like you've been given your tools, like with the magician, you've been given your tools, like go out there in the world. Then you've got the lovers, you know, partnership. And then it's about, right, what do we create out of life? But then they start to get into like a very spiritual, like, you know, we're talking about big themes like death is there, you know, our plans being shattered, connection to source. I'm thinking of like Hanged Man, places of surrender, strength, themes like faith, like how do you keep your faith despite the challenges of life, and then moving down to like the kind of elemental devil, well, you know, we were just talking about addiction, or bondage. That could be mental bondage or literal addiction. So like kind of all of the themes around life are there, but I interpret them myself, how I read them is like they're very, very spiritual. They're inviting us to be more to like think about our relationship with these things that happen in our lives, and understand that it's not personal. Actually, these are archetypes. These are human experiences that we all experience to some, you know, to greater or lesser extent at some point in our lives. and those cards are giving us some kind of advice, some guidance, or even just a reflection. Sometimes it's just a confirmation of like, that's what I'm experiencing, and that's just being witnessed by spirit, and that in and of itself can be very healing. And sometimes there is like, okay, don't do this, do that, or as the case may be, but it just depends. And like, yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I feel like that understanding for sure. I mean, without getting into the specifics of like each card, like that for me, like I interpret that and translate it as like the communication that I have like with my higher self, like with that, I guess you would say, intuition in that way.
Yes.
Yeah. So in a, like, basically these tarot are, like you said, there's these archetypes that kind of come in and they have these different messages. And of course there's 22, but there's almost like this overarching kind of like journey. And I think once we drop down into that cognitive level, and just like Jungian, Jung spoke about, there's, those 5 aspects, and really we're kind of like, I want to really consolidate and condense it down a little bit, and this is the part where like that past comes in, you know, and it's really like the persona, and then you have your animon, animus, and the self and the shadow. And for me, I kind of structured that, let's just call it an acronym, because sometimes that's what happens, when we have this construct of these archetypes, we just want to focus on one. And I feel like that's kind of where like Jung gave that like individuation. There was less of encouragement to say, okay, you are all of these, and also these other faculties that are there that we're not going to get into today, because I feel like it's just, we're entering this other door and creating this bridge from that mysticism and that outside, journey that's happening. And then you have this other lens of your cognition that sometimes when we don't identify these personas or these archetypes, then we kind of just allow them to pass by, like, oh, my shadow came up and I haven't really built a relationship with it. But then I keep asking like, oh, well, why is this happening? Why is this like facet there? Why do I keep experiencing things? And really, it's the consciousness that this is our focal point, and we have all of these facets that are here, and it's like, which one do we consciously choose from? And the way I see it is like, that external portion is like that whole journey, like we are going through that whole journey of the major arcana, but it's like, which facet are we choosing from? And for me, I feel like there's a lot of power in understanding each one of those and identifying, which is what we're going to go through today. And then in our body, choose whether we're gonna take the position and the perspective where we're gonna spectate from in that speaker or that listener. And really, that was the first question that we want to bring into this, which is, who is the speaker and who is the listener? So we have this lens of our cognition, of our mind, then we have this body that is feeling all these things, and we ask a question in our head, and then, we answer it. So it's like, okay, you definitely have these 2 aspects of you, but then who is the one that's actually doing it, So now you have like this internal portion. So we're kind of like starting to see these 3 levels, and I hope that, especially like sharing our experiences, because I have like a little bit of understanding of those, but to kind of discern these facets for myself. Like when that question came up, I was like, okay, that was a question that I asked myself a long time ago, because it really came down to it. I was like, I'm doing these meditations, right? And I'm asking myself all these questions. And then I really came down to it one day and was like, well, who the fuck am I asking? And I was like, well, then who the fuck is answering? Like, who is in there? So I had this previous knowledge, of these different archetypes, and then, I've heard about magician, I've heard about, what else was it? Like the Pisces being, the fish, and it was really just like the water aspect, and the water is like the unconscious. So I was like focused on what was this identity and this representation of me. So like breaking down that sense of like identity, when you're looking into these archetypes, it's like, what we've really created is the persona. And the persona is the person that like you see here, that's on the show, that his name is Max, and he has locks, and he fucking moved to Costa Rica, and blah blah blah. Like, it's the persona, it's the me,
Yeah.
And then going into the like, you understand that that's one facet, right? Like, for me, that was one door. And then you have this other part, the anima and the animus, which is basically what this show is about. It's about this understanding of that quadrant, that you are, yes, I may present as a man and you as a woman, but we do have this dualistic side to us, this masculine and this feminine. Now, in that masculine and that feminine, they both have polarities as well. So the anima being the feminine, the masculine portion of the feminine aspect, and the animus being the masculine portion of the feminine portion of the masculine. So when you have this representation, like, okay, I can see the polarity, and then there's duality in that. And then when you shift into the shadow, most people may think of it as like the unconscious or whatever the case is, but this is the thing that is really like, okay, if I'm this entity standing here and I have this projection of the persona, and then I also have this split projection of these both sides, I must have a shadow. There's something behind me that shows all of these other things because I'm a projection. This gives me an existence. So that it means that because everything is light, then there must be a contrast to that. So when the shadow comes up, it shows up in the things that we necessarily don't want to look at. When we start creating our life with like, oh, my mom did this, or my dad did this, or my brother did this, so I don't want to do this, and we end up creating that thing, So yeah, that's the concept of the shadow, because everything is in the mind, and then this is how your mind creates from these lenses. And then that last portion is the self, and the self being like this entity that's there, not the shadow, not the anima and the animus, and not the persona that's created, like that projection. It's the actual one that's having that experience.
Would you say that's the objective self? Like,
yes, I say that. Yeah. So when I had that understanding of like, okay, these are those facets, these are 5 or 4 aspects that I need to get to know, but this objective self that is there, that's the one that I'm choosing, because in that moment in time when I was asking those questions, I was being the speaker, but where I was spectating from was from my persona. So my persona was asking this self, and this self was the listener. So when that question came up, it was like, okay, who is the speaker and who is the listener? But you can't necessarily identify that until you see, like, what is the mind seeing? How is this mind, like, creating? And that's what I believe Jung did, and I feel like it's profound work that you can understand these archetypes and thank the Lord that he, just gave us 5. Because then when you go into the spirit realm, it's like you see this whole journey and this whole vast like thing that's happening in front of you, and then you get stuck in that. And, that's why I think like astrology and all these things are so compelling, because it's like, oh, I'm a Cancer, oh, I'm a Virgo, I'm ascendant rising. It's like you have all this. For me, it's like all that confusion, but in essence, I am all of that. I'm the universe. So coming back to that speaker and listener, I think that was the portion of really understanding that identifying those lenses gave me the opportunity and gave me the power to say, oh, I'm spectating from here, from that persona. Let me step back into the listener and give the listener the power. Now the listener becomes the speaker, and these other 4 aspects started becoming the listener. That for me started bringing in this journey of really beginning to like see and open up into those other levels. So I know that that's like, you speak about like how like I see things like all around here, and like, but that was my process. When you felt that question, or when you allowed that question to kind of like enter you, what was your process of kind of bringing that through? Because I know you have like a background with tarot, and like maybe from that into intuitive perspective.
I definitely would feel like I feel like with that question, I think my first experience of that was on a journey with, I had a journey with mushrooms, and that was when I first became aware that there was 2 aspects to myself. And basically in this journey, I was basically sitting back and watching these 2 sides of myself interact and have a conversation with each other. And I was like, oh, this is so cool. Like, and I was like, wow, because I was neither of them, but yet they're also obviously, like you say, they're part of the persona. They are a part of me, and I could recognize that. But then also, I was watching this these two parts of myself interact. And obviously, obviously it's helped by the medicine, helped me kind of get that into that mindset of like, wow, this is very interesting. And I remember thinking, I feel very lucky because my two sides of myself very different, but they actually get on. They were very like complementary. So that was very good. It was very harmonious, at least. And I think this has also come out like in therapy as well, like highlighting there's always like, I definitely see that there's two sides of myself. And it usually comes to me as a little boy on this side and a little girl on this side. Very, very different personalities, very different energies. So I guess when thinking about that, like and I guess I'm still on the journey of like trying to understand what those aspects or those visions, what they're telling me about myself, and I think what you're saying, and I think this is what's really, really important, is that when we're able to just take a little step back and observe that, like you said, there's a kind of light and then there's a kind of reflection that's coming back, and that's what's giving us the capacity to bring more light and have more understanding. Like when we're seeing that contrast, but when you're asking yourself those questions, when you're like almost like looking at yourself objectively, then you can start to see, oh right, you start to see things about yourself, you start to see things about your personality, you start to see the ways that you show up in the world, and then you start to understand, well, you start to bring more light to the shadow. I mean, it's arguable. I mean, and I'm not like a Jungian, I don't think I'm a Jungian fan. I'm not necessarily a Jungian fan, but I definitely, like, it's very interesting to me. But I think this idea that you'll never really fully bring light to your shadow. The shadow, the whole point of the shadow is that it's just aspects that you really find difficult to see about yourself. Not necessarily even bad. Like, it's just parts of yourself that you don't have access to. You're not able to observe. You're just not able to delve into. And that could be like untapped, like the quote that we put in last week's show, like that could just be untapped potential. That might not necessarily be like, the way you hoard all the cookies or whatever. Like, it's not necessarily a bad aspect of yourself. It might be, but it might not be. It's just the parts of yourself that you're not able to access and connect to. And we all have one, and we project it onto the world unconsciously. We don't realize, but that's what's happening. And I think when we start to dance with these, like you say, the persona, when you're able to sort of observe the persona a little bit more objectively, not fully objectively, but a little bit more objectively, start to see these different mechanics inside of oneself, then maybe you have a chance to understand how your shadow is playing out in the world, and then maybe have a chance to address that. I mean, and I say maybe, I say this tentatively because I'm incredibly humble and recognize that these are not easy things to do, and I would never, be like, I mean, I've looked at this stuff, but I'm still very humble and aware that, like, actually that's a job for life. That's not like, oh yeah, okay, cool. And even the Arcana saying that, you end with the world, but hey, we're going all the way back to not, you know what I mean? So even when you like reach a certain accomplishment or level or level of awareness, just know that there's a whole other layer, a whole nother level. Like, and that's a lifetime's work.
So where's the part of you figuring out which one is your speaker and which one is your listener?
I don't know if I figured that out yet. I don't know, because this is what I say. I love, like, it's so clear for you, and I love this. Like, it's so clear and objective, and like I love the way you're like able to kind of like step outside of yourself and kind of really see that and connect to that. And I'm not sure.
Well, I'm saying when we came up with this question,
yes,
was it like, what does that stir up for you? Like, which one of those, maybe whether it's in the mind or even in the Arcana, like which one usually do you feel like speaks for you? Because I'm trying to get an insight into this feminine aspect. Like, I feel like this portion of like me being objective and like sitting back and like doing those things, like that can come up for like, men, and maybe that's how we see it. Maybe some women see it that way. But I think there's because I also do have a position of asking my spirit as well, and like hearing my cards. Like even when I pull my cards, they come to me in different ways. I leave room for all of them to kind of speak to me, and that's where I open up to my, my spiritual as well to listen. So I allow them to speak, and I also allow self to speak. I allow my shadow to speak. I don't necessarily choose one, so it may seem like I'm very clear, or like objective, or I'm just sitting in one position, but for me, it's a wholeness. It's like a totality. Yeah. And this is why I want to start to just bring tools, because if like this question is really important for, if people are starting on this journey or starting to figure out, or maybe haven't experienced plant medicine and had that capability, or are not really intuitive or not really objective, is to kind of give that balance and that accessibility.
Yeah. So I guess, all right, to be more specific then, like if you ask me, like, where's my objective self? Like who or not who do I think my objective self? But when am I in that state of pure, like what I feel is my objective?
Well, no, not objectivity. Just who do you feel is the speaker, and which one do you feel is the listener? Or do they all have? Like...
I feel like like you said, I think they're in relationship with each other. So I guess I feel like my listener is my higher self, or like my objective self, let's say, or the self with the capital S, and I feel that state, that I don't want to say persona, it's not persona, like, but that state of being is like, I say pure love. Like, that's just when I'm just pure love. There's nothing but love and connection, and it's just a state of isness. Like, that's it. It's pure, just pure connection to source, right? There's no content, no nothing. It's just pure love. And then you anchor into the body, and then there's like all of this, like you say, your personality, what you're wearing, your clothes, like the life you live, the work you do, your family, your partner, like all of these things that we accumulate that say, oh, this is who I am. And then, but I definitely see that there's a separation there between like my persona, like, my self that operates in the world, and then a pure state of being that is definitely able to observe that to some extent, like I said, I say that, with caution, like to some extent. So, and I think sometimes we need help with that. Like, I definitely feel like, and this is why, also this podcast is really important, because I feel like in relation, we are helping each other see these parts of ourselves that we find hard to see by ourselves. Yeah.
Okay. So you feel like in that position that you say, like, that connection to higher self, higher source, and all of those things, and then as you come down, like through the mind and then into the body, it seems like these two connections from like that major arcana, like being in that journey and having that full spectrum of like continuous cycle, and then you have like this Jungian theory where there can be this tool for people to kind of, utilize these archetypes and things like that. When you're placing that in the body, how do you feel like that's expressed like within your life as things come up? Because this is the part of like the passing, right? It's like, if I'm just going from spirit to body, then I'm passing all of this mind stuff and all of these archetypes.
Yes.
So which, like you were saying, this divine light and this source, like, what do you feel like is the lens that majority or mainly that light is passing through to come into your body?
As in which element, like which, because I guess when I'm hearing you speak now, I'm thinking of the elements, because I'm thinking now more of the minor arcana, which consists of 4 elements, which is air, fire, water, and earth, which is related to like mind, action, emotions, and then body.
And there's other ones too, like I think it's like swords, cups.
Yeah, that's what they. Yeah.
Wands.
Yeah. So swords are mind and air, and then wands are fire and like action, and then
cups is emotion.
Emotions, yeah, and then pentacles
is earth.
Earth, yeah. Okay. So and then you feel the density, like swords are like it's air, right? It's like thoughts are like you say, like these are the world of ideas. Like, when you think like you're up at night and you think, yeah, I'm gonna that's a great idea. I'm going to set up that business. And then the next day, all right, now you've got to take the action. Now this is gets a little bit harder now. So now you've actually got to like do something. And now you've got to navigate all the things in the world that might, you know, that you've got to overcome in order to do that
Whilst
thing.
also still holding your cup, trying not to spill your drink.
Yeah.
While you're out there trying to draw a pentacle. You know, like, she gets crazy in the Arcana. Like, I understand that, like, the elements. So I know that I feel like we kind of like form these, you know, these three layers of, you know, the physical, the causal, and the mental plane. But now it's like this added like elemental filter that's there. It's like, oh, now you also got to navigate the elements and some cups and some swords and some wands and stuff. And it's like, ah, damn, see? I think that's the stuff that Jung wasn't really about. Like, he didn't jump into that, but we jumping into that. So I feel like, yes, in those lenses, for sure. I mean, if it's through that, but also like in dealing with the mind, like now that we've kind of created that, if there's any shift, because I feel like this is the bridge of like the masculine and feminine, you know, like yes, men are more logical, more of the mind, more of, you know, that energy, and like women are more of the body and more of the emotion and the sentiment, things like that. So, but we do also have like, you know, that contrast. So it's like kind of getting that understanding of how you utilize those tools or those lenses of these, like, you know, the persona, the anima, the animus, the self and the shadow. You know, like, how does that show up for you? Because I know for me in the Arcana, like a lot of mine is like I've done a lot of pentacle work to kind of like get my body, and like this is my earth, like that's what that represents to me. So doing like my physical practice and maintaining like my body, and then also like with the swords and with air is like cleansing the mind, doing chants, doing repetition, like affirmations, things like that. And then also like with the cups, like understanding my emotion, you know, and understanding that, like even if I am a Pisces, like I have all this water that's going around me, but understanding like to calm my storm consistently. And then it's also that fire, like how do I do that action? How do I stir up fire within myself and know when to burn, or also know when to like contain my fire and preserve it. So like I have that element as well. I just I'm interested and like curious to know what your utilization of these tools is.
So it's really interesting because I want to ask you like which element do you feel like is your strongest? Which element do you lead with? Do you have one that you lead with? And which element do you feel like is the one that you like have to work a little bit harder for, or one that you kind of bring into your life? Because I feel like it's interesting when we talk about the elements. I'm like, I can definitely see these different aspects in my life. Like I can really see where, you know, I can be really intellectual sometimes, where I can be a real action taker. I like to move, make things happen. And then how I can be like my nesting comfort, like, you know, in like really in my body. And then when I can be like super emotional. But if you ask me, I'm a more feeling person. That's definitely the one that I lead with. But that's not necessarily, it's not necessarily the case that when I do my readings, I'm always going to get cups in my reading. You know, that's how you start to work with the tarot. But I guess that's kind of what I would ask you is like, do you feel like there's a element that you work with like more naturally, that just sort of comes to you more naturally, and then there's one that maybe you have to work a little bit harder with and kind of...
I think I've had my relationship with all of them, and I think it was just understanding and learning them differently. But I would probably say, I think it just really depends. I don't necessarily feel like I lead with a specific one. Like even when I've like read my cards or anything like that, like I feel like I'm a very like mental person and like thoughts and things like that, but also I'm not, and I've never like really had like wands or swords come up like in any of my cards. But there's also like an understanding with like earth and like my body, and like that I feel more. But I think there's like an exercising of all of them, you know. But you're still not gonna get away from the question of which of those lenses comes through your mind, because I feel like that is an important thing, especially like with these, especially maybe there's like women out there trying to understand and like gain a different concept of like how to exercise their reason and their discernment and all of these different things. Because even if your cards, like say if when your cards do come up, how do you know which one is speaking to which?
Well, that's where you.
If I'm leading, but this is what I'm saying. This is the question I'm asking you. Like, if you're taking a position from your shadow, and these are all the things you don't want to listen to, and then these cards come up, it's like, oh, I'm just gonna walk back into my life and go into my body and just start acting. But then, aren't you acting from the shadow? Or maybe you're standing in your animus, or maybe you're still in your persona. Like, what is there, if there is any, a tool that you utilize to discern, like, which of those lenses is which?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where we start to get this is when tarot gets interesting, because, you know, I definitely would say I use my intuition, right? I would also say it's really, really hard to, like, read for yourself. It's much better to have someone read for you. But still, there's times when you should, like, I read every day, my cards. I want to keep building a relationship with my cards, with, like, the messages and with whatever comes through on a board. And then also what's part of that relationship is how I choose to interpret those cards. So it's not just, oh, I've interpreted those cards, that's the story. Well, no, I also have to reflect on the fact that I've interpreted those cards in that way. So there's also, like, that reflection coming back of, like, oh, that's interesting. Like, where's that coming from? Like, what themes are happening in my life at the moment? And that's also a part of the reflection. It's not just what's on the board. It's also like, okay, well, what's on the board? How have I interpreted that? Interesting. Why have I interpreted that? And then there's another layer that comes in that's like, interesting, because that's what's happening in my life at the moment. That's how I'm seeing that these cards are related to it. And that may or may not be true. But that's how I've chosen to interpret them. And that is also telling me that's also telling me something about how I'm seeing or how I'm experiencing my life.
So who is that? Who do you mean? Is, like, what life? How do you make that discernment of who this applies to?
I've never asked myself that question.
Right, which is why the question is in there. This is the curious question, because then that is the listener. And one of those is the speaker, essentially. Yeah. So who do you feel like, based on what we've kind of explained here, is the one that is, I guess, accepting the card?
Yeah, I feel like, you know, when I was first grappling with this question, I was like, well, obviously my higher self is the listener, and my like, obviously my higher self is the listener, and then, like, my persona is, like, the speaker. But now I'm like, is it though? Actually, maybe it's the other way around. Actually, I can really see that, actually, more so that my higher self is actually, like, to some extent, there's some direction happening from this part of my psyche, part of my higher self, like, however you want to conceive it. But there's definitely some direction that's happening and filtering down into my body or my experience, and guiding me, pulling some strings, like, you know, helping me, and, like, seeing, like, you know, giving me little nudges, or like, or shifting me in certain types of way. And I'm like, okay. And in a way, that higher self is doing that, and also that shadow self is also doing that. So that's where you're kind of starting to see that kind of relationship between those two aspects of self. And maybe when you want to say, like, you know, to you know, angel and the devil on the shoulder, maybe you want to interpret it like that. But definitely that you have, you know, you definitely having a higher, you know, a higher perspective that seems to be wanting your best, is working in your own interests and really wanting the best for you, and guiding you in that way. And then there's also another opposite force that's anchoring you down in some type of way. And I definitely feel like we have a choice. I mean, I definitely feel those two energies are always present in our lives. Like, I don't think you can just clean off and just forget about your shadow. I think it's always there to some extent. But I do think you have a choice about which aspects of that voice, which voice you choose to listen to more, and how you then feed that. Like, so, you know, I feel like my cards always give me a lot of guidance, a lot of advice, you know, how to deal with things. Like, so, for example, you know, you've got a card, the Five of Swords, for example. It's all about conflict and, you know, competition, and winning at all costs, doing whatever you got, you know, like, it's quite again, not necessarily a negative card, depending, because you can read it in other ways. But it's a challenging card. It's a card that represents challenge. And then, but you might have that in a spread, and then the strength card comes out afterwards. And so it might be, hey, listen, don't fight fire with fire. You know, so that energy might be present, but don't fight fire with fire. This is how, or temperance, for example. Like there might be an advice about how to manage certain things that are happening. So whereas, yeah, my shadow self might have said, listen, let's roll up our sleeves, yeah. Like I'm gonna fight fire with fire. But actually there's maybe a higher self is coming through and saying, hey, no, there's a spiritual lesson here, and this is what the spiritual lesson is, and like and guiding that way. And I feel like that's the relationship I have, at least with my cards, and to that voice, that higher self, that I feel like is always encouraging me to do better, be kinder, be more loving, be more forgiving. Let it go, like let go. It doesn't matter, you know. Don't get caught up and involved in so many things, you know. And to some extent, that's possible. But we're all here in this earth plane doing this thing called life. We're all getting stuck into it. But to some extent, how can I honor that part of myself, that higher self that says, hey, like, just let it go. Like, be more loving, be more kind, be more forgiving, have faith, stop worrying so much.
Beautiful. Okay, so what, like, now I'm getting a little bit more insight into like this intuitive sense, you know, because I get the communication a little bit differently in the relation to whether it's the cards or whether it's my spirit. And I think this is like an important thing that, you know, like I communicate with myself, and like I've done that work to kind of understand like this relationship with, you know, whether you call it intuition, whether you call it spirit, higher self, whatever the case is. And this is something that I try to convey to men as well, as developing the intuition, because it's also about the practicality too. It's, you know, I mean, I've chosen to do the things that I've done in like the journey, but my journey is not, you know, the same for everybody else. So what I kind of want to distill here is like practices that we can actually do, but it's really this sense of where are you actually more comfortable in that spirit, you know, of the arcana, or maybe in the elements, or maybe in the mind, or maybe just in the body. But really, it's that element of taking that position of the speaker and the listener, but also understanding like where is that unknown and where is that mystery. Because like you were saying with the shadow is that there is this place that, you know, we don't necessarily have access to, that things show up. I personally believe that the relationship that I've developed with my shadow, I have access to that. And that, I feel like, is that sense of, like you were kind of explaining with the Fool, like the zero, the potential energy. So for me, I see it in a sense of like, okay, when I understand like how you just explained this whole like journey, and then you just go through again, I see that this earth is really my connection to body, right? And on this other aspect, it's like you said, the potential energy, but anything is possible. So for me, that's the shadow. Like when I'm thinking of the mind, right? And in this archetype of Jung, right? And there's that shadow that I can't see because my objective self is here. So that relationship that I've built with the mystery and the unknown and the potential and like everything that's there, I've went into that space. So for me, it was like through meditation and unraveling like myself, and unpeeling the persona and building a relationship with that, unpeeling the animon and building a relationship with that, unpeeling the animus, the relationships with parents, friends, all of these different things, and looking at these different petals that kind of like came off. So yeah, that relationship with that mystery and that unknown feels very comfortable for me. And also building another persona feels very comfortable. The sense of like going through the whole arcana and like understanding that journey is happening regardless. You can't, I've understood that, like I've spoken to my higher self and I'm like, he's like, you can't do anything about this. This is happening. You better get in line and like figure out the rhythm of your life, what you want to do down there in the earth, and like get those elements in line. I'm like, all right, fuck, great. Yeah, let's do it, you know? So for me, it was like, okay, how can I develop, like when I got to build these relationships, is like, oh, well, how do I build a practice, for these things as I'm coming back out of that? And like you were explaining about this, like my relationship with the elements and, with the swords and, the different suits. That for me is how I built a practice. I built a practice for earth. I built a practice for air. I built a practice for fire and water. And that was me coming, like, bridging from that spirit to the body. So in this, it's like, for men to kind of understand that mystery and that unknown, for me, I would say that there's an encouragement to, you have to be brave enough and have to have the courage enough to look at your shadow. Because for me, it was, everybody is most likely, like, afraid of the shadow. And, like, when you're a kid, it's like, oh, you're afraid of the dark. Like, yeah, I'm fucking afraid of the dark. Like I told you, I grew up with ghosts. So being in the dark was like, I had a very long, like, apartment. So it was like, how do I get from my room to the bathroom without any lights? Run as fast as you can. So it was kind of like this, this gusto to, like, go into the dark, like, go into it, accept it, like, fully be in it. But then you also had to get back to the room, like, and turn off all the lights on the way, So for me, like, it was like, that is kind of like the physical understanding of, like, just growing up in that way. But how do you practically do that in real life now? Like, and I feel like you being in the position that you are with, and just for being a woman, it's like, you are the unknown, you are the chaos, you are the, the darkness, the mystery, all of these things. So in that, like, what would you say is, like, a good practice to maybe get your understanding of what you would consider as, like, the mystery or the unknown, which is what I feel for you here is this whole Jungian theory in the mind section, that where I feel like the past came up, because you're like, I'm going to go from the major arcana past all of that, right into the body. We're just going to go bring it right into the body. So what would you consider as your mystery unknown, and, like, how do you feel with comfort with it?
With the mystery. That's been a journey. That's a recent journey, I feel. Because so I guess how I understand it, and then I'll talk about kind of how I feel like it plays out in my life. But how I understand it is that the mystery is the place of pure potentiality, is the place of, like, the unknown. And often we're afraid of that. Like, often that's the space that we're afraid of, because we don't have control over it. We don't know. Like, often even when I have clients, people come and see me, like, there's a nervousness. Or even if people know, oh, I work with tarot, or, like, I work as a psychic or whatever. And then people are like, oh no, like, that means that this person's going to see things about me, and I don't, like, what necessarily want people, like, I don't, oh no, what's spirit going to say? Like, and if people think they're going to get into trouble, or, you know what I mean? So there's, like, this kind of fear around this, yeah, like, the relationship with mystery, because it's, like, pure potentiality, what might pop out.
The fear of the unknown.
Yeah, because you just don't know. And then, but this is also the ego, right? So the ego has this desire to control. This ego wants to know what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, how it's going to happen, so that I can be ready for it. And I feel like my relationship, yes, has been like, how do I just be okay with not knowing? And that may seem like a misnomer, like, well, but you work with tarot, you work with, like, in the psychic realm, isn't that all about knowing what's going to happen? No, actually, I feel like as my relationship with these spiritual practices or these spiritual tools has become more and more stronger, what's actually happened is I'm learning to be more okay in the mystery. And like I feel like maybe, like, in my 20s, like, everything was about, I want this is where I want to be, this is what it's got to look like, this is how I want things to happen. And it was like, and I tried to control my life so much, and then obviously it blew apart. That's tower. It blew apart. It was like, no, this is shit, start again. And then you're like, oh no. And that is the ego. Like, that is ultimately what that, and that tower is about truth. It's like God just said, shit foundation, build that again. Like, you constructed this on sand, basically. Go and build it on something more true, which is your higher self, your, like, that, your true, that is the impermanent self, like the permanent self, should I say. And then it's like, how do I start, like you said, like, how do I start to live that? How how does that start to actually come into like an experience in the world? And I think it is just really letting go and being like, okay. And also, I guess for me, it's ended up being like more instinctive. Like, I just know what's for now. Like, okay, what do I need to do in this moment? What's this moment asking of me? Just do that. Surrender the rest. I mean, that could be, I can even anchor that into like yogic philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita, which is like, hey, you know, your higher self is not accumulating karma, only your causal self, like your body. And why on earth would you think you're in control anyway? How dare you? Basically. And you know, when we have we have our dreams for what we want for ourselves, our lives, you know, gotta look like this, it's gotta be like this. And actually I feel like I call it God, but like, you know, God's like trying to wrestle. Let go. Like, man, this could be so much better. Like, I've got such a bigger and better plan for you. And if you just let go, then you can open yourself up to that. But that also means opening yourself up to the unknown. Right. And that is what we're so uncomfortable with, because there's a fear. Oh no, hold on a minute, they're going to roll up on me behind my back. Well, no, like and it is like kind of sometimes imagine it of like you're on a cliff and you just like let yourself fall back and trust that the hands of God are going to come and
So you really found comfort in that, in, I guess, these other practices of like taking on yoga and taking on these ways of life and things like that kind of provided that support, and then also kind of just having God, the universe, Shakti, whatever you want to call it, just kind of fuck up your whole life tower and just be like, build that shit again. And then you're like, oh, fuck, okay, cool, I'm going to do it again.
But from a place that's more genuine. Like, before you're like, oh, yeah, it's true. Like, who even was that? Why was I doing? Why did I want those things? Like, actually,
but I feel like that's what happens continuously with life, and I feel like that's where I've seen personally, like in my life, and I mean, I definitely learned, but I also see it happen continuously in some people's lives where things keep going to shit, and then they try to build it again, but it's like you're not orienting yourself in that unknown, because that's where the potential is, and also just for me, like when I entered that space, I was like, there was this, I love fear. Like, I dive into that shit. Like, I'm like Kendrick Lamar. I'm just like, give me a boo full of fear and I'm a dive in, you know? And when I went into that space, there was nothing. And I was like, wow. Like, at first, there was this sense of, like, what you would call fear. But it wasn't, I didn't translate it as fear. It was just like, holy shit, like there's nothing here. Then you have like the thought was like, you're nothing, and it's like, there's no emptiness here. There was just like, oh, this is potential. I can do whatever I want. And that was my premise to like, oh, I can do whatever the fuck I want. So for me, like, yes, it was the mindset, but then also there was this intuitive side that was like you're magical, do fucking anything. Like, yeah, your spirit like told you that there's this rhythm happening, but what are you going to do with that? And it was like, okay, learn the elements, learn the planets, learn this. Like, and then that for me translated into like my body as like self-discipline. It was like the learning of self. So what I kind of like bring to people as far as like when we're building practice and looking at this mystery and this unknown, it's like, one, you have to, I feel like personally that there's a link to a fear of that unknown and that fear of the mystery. Like, why are you afraid of not knowing? That is, I feel like, is the personal question that you have to ask yourself. And also, how do you dissolve that fear? And like for me, a good approach was like, I love words. And with my perspective, it was like a lot of the fear was in the mind of like, oh, well, I don't know this. And like the persona is like, oh, but what if you let go of like how you dress and like all your fucking outfits and all your like coordination and like how you like do this and like how you're that person. And then the anima is like, oh no, but like you have to be this type of man. The animus is like, oh, but you're also supposed to be like this and be kind and loving and salting and like that. And it's like you have all these different, and it was like, yo, like all of y'all are afraid. And it was like taking that expectation from that higher self, like you said, is like with you is with that love and like bringing in that love and kindness. And it was looking at all of them and being like, hey, you know what? fear just actually is a process. Like, how about all of you go through this and face it first? And that's what the F stood for me. And then it was like, embrace it now. And it was like, okay, once you did that, now come back. Okay, now after embracing it, now go back and accept it. And then it was like, I gave like this task to these things, but it really took them on this journey and through a process. And for me, that helped in a sense of like slowing down. And then at the end, it was like, oh, you fully accepted everything? Great, now rewrite it. And then they were all like, what? Like, we could do that? But by that time, that whole journey that like my spirit, like you're still going through, you know, the stages of the Fool. You're going through the stages of, I don't know the whole arcana, but for me, it was like these different phases. And when the mind was busy and the body was busy building practices, the spirit was like, okay, we're setting this rhythm and we're getting you attuned to whatever this truth is. And then you can kind of align yourself with the creator, you know? And like that was, for me, was the purpose. So I think it's like important for people to kind of understand, where are you spectating from? From where do you feel like your known is? Because that is the comfort zone. So even if you're taking that comfort zone from that speaker and that listener, but you haven't identified them, then you're moving like in the dark. You're moving in the clouds. And then also, if you still have this sense of like, I'm afraid of mystery and I'm afraid of unknown because I'm attached to what I know, you really know nothing, you know? So there's also that portion too, which is why this is the premise of this podcast, is to kind of understand this whole capacity of who we are in general. And like that we have the empowerment to choose of where we're going, but we also have to identify first. And for me, it's all about like a process, because once you allow these other archetypes, as you would say, or these other foundations and these layers to go through their process and to kind of align, and really for me, that's transcendence. Is like, it's not like, oh, I'm gonna fucking like exit my body and fucking transcend into like a golden being and I'm just gonna be peace and love and bliss and be in samadhi. No, it's none of that. It's like to let go of what you thought and let go of all the anchors, like you were saying in this sense, but also realigning yourself towards your future, because you are creating that. And once you identify these different aspects within your mind and within your spirit, and you understand these, there's this bridge, then you can walk across all planes. And for me, that's transcendence.
And that's magician. That's a magician. Like,
I'm a magician.
All the elements, like you know, right tools for right time. Like, you know what I mean? Just knowing how to draw on. Right. Yeah, like having a relationship with all of those elements of self and being able to like draw on them and bring them in, and then it becomes play. Then life becomes a play. Like, it becomes joyful and fun because we're just working with elements, and then the higher self is watching. Oh, isn't this fun? This is interesting. But in order to do that, you have to let go as well. So there's like, you know, and I think the yogis speak of this, like you know, sometimes they talk about the siddhis, which are like superpowers that come when you do spiritual practice. So what happens is once you...
But hold on. Before we get into spiritual, superpowers, because I know we could like go on with that. When you say let go, like... So for me, in this instance, like I wanted to give that as like a masculine perspective of like, if you do have fear in the mind, like that's a process of like kind of breaking down that, you know, that fear of facing, embracing, accepting, and rewriting. When you say let go, like for me, just as a man hearing that, I'm like,
what does that mean?
Yeah.
What,
like generally, like in that, I'm like, I'm not letting go of anything. Like, it's my life. How do I let go of that? What would be your advice to, because you seem like comfortable in that, because that is the nature, but you've also come to understand that you've had this intuitive nature to hear, you know, God speak to you in your higher self and develop that relationship to be able to feel safe enough to like let go and like fall off that cliff. So what would you kind of like offer in that sense of like coaxing somebody to be like, oh, okay, like it's okay to like fall off a cliff? Because that's quite scary.
You've got to, because you've got to not care. Like, you've got to be like,
how can you not care? It's your life.
Well, yeah, I know. So maybe not care. Maybe not care. Maybe that's the wrong expression. But you've got to maybe like, and I think, and I had this the other day actually, because I had this moment of anxiety and fear on the way back from Panama, right? And I was like, I was like, oh my God, like, you know, it was just
boat.
pure panic. Yeah, the boat. I'm like, oh my God, I'm on this boat. I'm going to be late. Then I'm going to miss this. Then the whole day is going to be ruined. And I had this, and that was all that was going in my mind. Like, this is all going wrong. And then somehow that voice was there going, Shucks, why do you always do this? Calm down, breathe, center, everything's fine. And I couldn't trust it. Because I was in such a panic. I was like, I could hear that voice, but I was like, I just can't. And I could see it. I could hear that voice. And then I was observing this anxiety and this panic. And I guess, how did I let go in that moment? I was like, all right, let's do it. Let's do the thought experiment. What's the worst that could happen here? What is the worst? And I was like, I was envisioning all sorts of awful things. I was like, I mean, it's like open sea, right? Like, because you're like basically traveling from one island to the other. And I was like, what's the worst that can happen? There's another boat going at high speed, going to bash into this side of this boat. The boat splits in half. And I was like thinking, oh my God, I've got my laptop with me. I'm like, I know I can swim. I know that's fine. Like, I know I can swim. That's absolutely fine. I was like, shit, I don't even care about the contents of my suitcase. But I'm like, my laptop, it's got like all my work on it and I haven't backed it up. And I was like, all right, so the worst could happen, right? You survive, you're in the middle of the water. And then like, all right, you've lost all your work. What then? And I was like, that's the worst thing. Like, in my mind, I was like, that's where like the pinnacle of my fear was. And I was like, okay, so what happens then? What happens? Life goes on. You deal with it. Life goes on. And then I was like, okay, so we can deal with it. We can deal with the worst thing. Like, the worst thing that could happen, I'm like, we would live with it. And life would go on and I'd find a way. And then I was like, okay, cool. And then I was able to just let it go and listen to that voice. It was like, it's going to be fine. Then I got to the port. It was late. The other boat was late. It was absolutely fine. There was nothing to worry about. And then I got that voice saying again, why don't you listen? Like, why do you always have to do, like, why do we have to do this the hard way? Like, why? And I always say that. I mean, that is my process. Like, I panic first, and then it's just my process. I don't know why, but I have to have a little panic first.
Okay.
And then I talk myself down, you know, like down. And so I guess that letting go, yeah, it's not just like, yeah, just let go, whatever. Like, that was my process.
Okay. Beautiful. I love that. Because that's the feeling, and that's being in the body. So like that, yes, I feel that in the sense of like a lot more people can resonate with that of being like in the body. Because me, I'm over here, I'm like, I would never create any of that. Like, but I'm like, that's beautiful that you have such an imagination that a high-speed boat is just gonna come and rip your boat in half. That's brilliant. So that's a way to make yourself feel it. I think that is the mystery, and that's the unknown, because it's like, that could be. I think that's the language that our body speaks, is like, and you have that language and that understanding with, oh yeah, this is my process to understand that I need to feel it, and I also need to feel the worst, because that's how I'm feeling now, and like meeting yourself there and like bringing yourself back to let go. I think that's beautiful. So bam, I feel like we have been like creating this. I mean, because, you know, we see this quadrant, we're experiencing it, and it's like hard to navigate. It's like up, down, left, right, back, forth, in, out, all different dimensions, be like whatever it is. So for me, in a way, there's this understanding that, yes, there's this higher self. For me, it's the causal plane. You were saying that's a whole different story. You were saying like, oh, the body's the causal. I'm like, what? But anyway, because really it's like, you know, when you see yourself as a multi-dimensional being, it's like, that's that bridging. But when you understand that your mind is this power of transcending these dimensions, and it's experiencing them simultaneously, you start to understand that, yeah, the body is it's receiving these signals and all these different things, from whether if it's your thoughts from your shadow, whether if it's your thoughts from your anima, your animus, or your persona, or whoever these signals are coming through. If those signals are not clear and we haven't like established another line to the end of them, then we get these so-called like triggers. And I don't personally like the word triggers. Like, I like engrams, and it's really just like stored imprints that are within us, because it's really just a catalyst, like something externalized, and you're going to see it regardless, or whatever the case is. But for me, I've come to an understanding that in life, we only experience triggers when we have a judgment or like a resistance against it. And for me, I lean into all resistance because I'm like, wherever there's resistance, I'm gonna gain understanding. So that next question that kind of like came up to it, it's like it ties into like your boat thing. Is like you kind of have this process of understanding, like in your body, when your body feels that panic, it's like you have to meet it at where it's at the worst. So when you would say for somebody that has these triggers or these signals that come in, like what would you say is like a cue for that? And like also, what do you do in like understanding those coping mechanisms, or like how you kind of deal with it? Like, I mean, you kind of explained it in that way, but to continuously experience like these triggers, can one actually dissolve those by identifying those cues?
Yeah, I do. I do. You know, I guess I think you're absolutely right. Like when you talk about imprints, yeah, like in yoga they call them samskaras, or like could be karma, like basically aspects of self where there's like fault lines essentially underneath, like your like kind of ley lines, little fault lines, and then like somehow.
Is that a card? Is that like a arcana card?
What, a fault line?
Yeah.
No.
Okay. I'm trying to figure out which card is like the thing that you can like equate to triggers. Be like, oh, if it comes up, what is that? I don't want to take you off guard, but this is what I'm thinking.
Oh,
right now.
Yeah. I'm trying to think like what would be, because I did have this recently where it felt like a trick, like it was a combination card. I can't remember what the combination was, but it felt like, and I think one of them was the Tower. And then it felt like there was another card I remember with it, and it felt like a trigger. It was like, okay, no, this comes first, and then that's what causes it. Like, as in, some people think, all right, like basically how I read it was like, oh, the Tower is not objectively happening to this. The Tower is only happening because this is present already. Okay. So that means that's the fault line. Like that was the issue. That was the thing. I think it was the Five of Cups. Actually, now I'm thinking about it, I have to go back in my little journal and look. But it was like that was what was present first, and then there's something that triggers that and then creates the Tower. So you can't have a trigger if there isn't already some kind of imprint there that like, or wound, or
thank you.
Yeah, you can't. The trigger doesn't come from nowhere.
Right.
It's very much connected to an experience, whether that be this lifetime, childhood, or previous lifetimes. But there's things that we, like you say, like there's a resistance there. There's a kind of like that. Or an activation or some kind of emotional reaction that feels uncontrollable, and that's how I would describe a trigger. And I think the cues for that is like understanding what it is. Like, what is your fault line? You want to go back to that that aspect, that little fault line. Sometimes I imagine it like landmines. You know, like you're just kind of walking around and bam, like, you know. Just suddenly, where's that coming from? That's not random. Like that isn't just like, oh man, I just, you know, no, like that comes from somewhere. And actually, like you say, if you go right down into the root, then I don't know if you can, again, like I'm not sure, like I don't know. I'm not at that stage where I can be like confidently say, yeah, no, I think you can just get rid of all your triggers. Like I'm not sure, from my perspective at least. But I definitely think you can become more aware of where your triggers are, and then you can make different choices based on that. Like more informed choices about spaces, places, people that honor who you are, basically.
Right. Yeah, I feel like that makes a lot of sense, and it's kind of like what you just explained, like with the boat, right? It's like you notice that your mind is like, okay, I'm thinking about this, and like this is so it's kind of like that higher self kind of came in. It was like, okay, I see what you're doing. And you want to think about all the worst case scenario, but you're not actually creating any worst case scenario. So let's actually create a worst case scenario. And like, that is what, when you showed yourself that and showed your mind that, it kind of like brought it down. So that, I guess that cue or that signal was in the mind, which is like the fear is in the mind because the unknown is in the mind. And I'm not here to say, make any connections, but I feel like that is where like that pass was through, because those relationships in those archetypes within the mental, whether it's like persona, anima, animus, shadow, or the self, is like that is where there's kind of like some space of I guess you would say fear, or like where those triggers or those things come up. Because I'm a personal believer that I practice gun safety. So it's like, if you dissolve all your triggers, then you can't be pulling a gun on somebody, you know what I'm saying? Because that's essentially like what happens. Because, and I know this personally because I trigger everybody. And it's like, it's literally my job. Like, I'm a shadow coach. Like, that's what I do, you know? And I wrote this whole piece about it because, like, with understanding with men and, like, doing a lot of the men's work that I've done around PTSD, around suicide, around depression, anxiety, all these different things, it's this war mentality. And sometimes when you're in a war mentality, you have, it's like a warm mentality. So I feel warm in this war mentality. Like, if I have a gun, like, I feel safe. And really at the center of that nervous system, we all crave safety. So when that trigger pops up, it's like, oh, my safety is like compromised, so I gotta like pull that gun on somebody. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
But it's like, when you start to understand, even like with the Five of Cups, understanding those emotions and being like, okay, like, I am safe. Yeah, I got this gun on my hip, and like, it can get crazy for you because like I can pull out the fire, I can pull out the wand, and like, I got the tools for it. And when you have that understanding and you allow that fear to kind of like dissipate, and you can face it and you can embrace it, like if this person comes to you with anger or malice or jealousy or whatever, and it's like really being like, oh, okay, cool, like I can see this. So for men, I usually give them the same tool that I did, which is like practicing discernment. And with this gift of like looking past, you know, and when you have this lens of like the mind and you have these personas that are in front of me, when I experience triggers that come in, or like, this is what I use as like a cue, and then I understand what coping mechanisms I normally go into, like, oh, if this trigger or this experience, whether it's a person, place, thing, whatever the case is, say if that goes through the lens of, let's say, my persona, like somebody's coming at my persona, then I have a relationship with this persona, and I don't identify with it, so I'm over here, and I see it creeping through this door, and I'm like, bro, like, you already know what to do. Like, oh, you're gonna cope with overcompensation, you're gonna cope with like, oh, I had the capability to do this, maybe it's gonna be like a witty comment, maybe you're gonna be a smart ass. Cool, you know what to do. So take that, and I can see it and observe it and be like, okay, well, that's not necessarily me, so I can take it and receive it and I can feel it, but I can choose whether to be involved in it or not, or allow and be like, okay, cool, you're experiencing that, you need to sit with that, cool, put the persona over here, and I can come through with myself, or I can come through with my animus or my anima. And it's like, I think that's the power that I essentially want to convey to people and like translate, that you have the power to do that. When you step back, or when you you don't even have to necessarily step back. You can take a position of, I want to stay in my shadow the whole time. And like, most of the time, that's where I like to chill. I like to be in that space because, like, for me, it feels comfortable in a position to not be like blindsided by certain things. But then there's times where I'm like, oh, I need to be fully like in my animus, you know, and I want to understand this feminine aspect, you know, whether I'm around like children or a partner or whatever the case is, because I'm in a state of like receptivity if there's a place that I want to learn. So this is like, I mean, this is kind of coming into that last question of like these strategies of like how we can determine these things. And really it comes down to what we're explaining right now, is this whole quadrant of understanding this feminine aspect of you and understanding this masculine aspect of you, and understand that you're on this spectrum. You have all of these arcana, you have this spiritual aspect. You also do have this Jungian mind, which is really just, sometimes it can get past, you know, and it's really that understanding that persona, understanding that anima and animus, that self and that shadow. Understanding, and these are aspects of yourself and facets of yourself that you can engage with. Like, you know, we were speaking about the speaker and the listener, and it's like you can interchange, because you as a conscious being have that sense of placing yourself in the objective self and saying like, I consciously choose to be in my shadow, or I consciously choose to be in my persona, or I consciously choose to be as the fool, and understand that I'm tapping into that rhythm, and I understand that that's the phase that I'm at in my life. I understand that I can step into the water element and understand my emotions and come up with a practice to figure out like that's where the imbalance is. And when you can look at the cards, you can really understand like, what am I interpreting here? What is speaking to me, and who is choosing to listen right now? Who is this card speaking to? And I think that is where we kind of get that intention. And this is something that I speak to like my guy friends about as well. Is like they're like, oh, like you fucking like tarot and shit. I'm like, yeah, bro. Like that. If I'm gonna sit here and be so smart, and I'm just having a conversation with myself, I'm like, that sounds dumb. I'm like, you're just telling yourself what to do. I was like, you're not asking for help, but then you say, oh, like I know how to ask for help. How? If you can't leave it objectively to something else that's here and then give yourself an intention to kind of reflect back, that's the way I see my cards, in a way of like connecting to that intuition. And I think that's a good practice to exercise that in the same way as exercising those, like your discernment, to practice discerning whether I want to choose whichever lens I can within my mind or within my spirit, and then that ultimately gives yourself the allowance to like settle and rest and relax, and you have that ability to let go and let God, because essentially that is the quadrant. You know, it is the masculine, it is the feminine, it is the light, it is the dark, and this is really kind of that dance between understanding and identifying that these levels and these dimensions are there, and I am a multidimensional being, and you don't have to be overwhelmed or afraid or in fear of that mystery and that unknown, because you are the mystery and you are the unknown, as well as being the known, you know?
Absolutely.
So I think, yeah, I mean, is there any more that you want to say about this quadrant? Because I feel like, I mean, essentially this is what we want to do for you guys, is like build this construct that like we know we're also understanding and learning as well by sharing these, and also just create this concept that's already there, but also bring some light to it, bring some real life experiences, and then practical ways to like uplift and leverage what's already in place, rather than like recreate the wheel, you know? So yeah, do you have anything else, like as far as strategy wise?
I mean, yeah, definitely. I think like again, my process is definitely way more internal. So like kind of thinking about triggers, or you know, when faced with, like you said, like say a situation comes, a situation happens, and you have a choice point at that moment. Something happens in your life. Let's say, for example, someone's coming at you, you know what I mean? Like in a certain type of way that feels negative, that feels harmful, feels like, you know, suddenly you're triggered, whatever emotion that's triggered. You have a choice point right there. How do I respond? And then, I don't know, like I think for me, that response always is informed by the emotion that is present. So like, so for example, you know, some of the emotions that we talked about, like, for example, shame, anger, like feeling like a victim, for example. So for me, that point starts there. What is this situation, this person, or this thing, this trigger? What is the feeling, first of all? And let's say anger. Let's say that feeling is anger. Okay, so what am I going to do with that? What happens now? Like, okay, so I've identified the emotion that's happening. Okay, so I'm feeling angry now. And some of that is internal, some of that's mine, and some of that's obviously connected to the experience I'm having. And then there's a choice point right at that point. And that is where you get the choice to like de-escalate or escalate. Like you can make this a lot worse, or you can make this a lot better. And then I guess that's where we come back to our two little, you know,
angel and devil.
Aspects on our who do we listen to? Which voice do we listen to when we have those choice points? And you know, and I think I'm lucky because I feel like I have a connection to feel like I know what it feels like to be in a place of peace. I know what it feels like to be in that place of like fully connected. And that's kind of where I'm always going to want to inch towards no matter what. So so it's very obvious to me when I'm not in that. If I'm feeling anger, if I'm feeling shame, if I'm feeling sadness, la 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 la, all of these things, these are, oh right, okay, I can feel where, like, how have I managed to come away from my center? How have I come away from where I feel I ought to be? And
centered
then,
in peace.
Yeah.
Okay.
and then how what are the actions I need to take to get back to that place? So I guess that is, you know, a recent example is just feeling the emotion, just letting it pass through me, like letting it, you know, we had the discussion about like we just have a really, really different process, like in that sense. Like for me, I let it affect me. I let the effect be present, and then I'm like, okay, and then I just sit with it and let it move through me, and then I have my choice. Then I make my choices, and it's not. I don't want to be reactive. I don't want to be like, oh, I'm feeling this thing. Oh, I've got to get rid of it. I've got to, like, you know what I mean? And I'm not saying that's what you do. I'm like just saying that would be that's kind of how I think. I need to get rid of this. I need to not feel this. I need to like, and actually, no. What happens if you just go, all right, let me feel it. This is what I'm feeling, and then it loses its charge. It doesn't have such a charge on you so much. You're like, okay, cool. This is where we are right now. And then let it move through. And then, like, you know, you can explore where that core trigger comes from and things like that. I think that's helpful. But then also it's just that choice point. I have a choice in that moment. There's a choice. And from here, I can make this better. I can make this worse.
That's beautiful. I think that's like a perfect example, and also a perfect segue of like the next episode of what we're gonna, as we're creating this quadrant and this almost like capsule. It's taking back that power of understanding that we can do these practical things by identifying what these aspects are, but then taking back that power and understanding that we're empowered to make a choice to not be reactive, but to actively and consciously choose to respond. And I feel like this is going to be a nice portion to go into in the next one, with that balance of these two, you know, angel and devil, and the masculine and feminine, and these
Self
two different,
and other.
right? But also, once we settle into that peace in that center, like what can we do after that, like into that potential, you know? And that will be like in the next episode, I think is a real good send off here so that we can wrap up. But yeah, thank you so much. Like I feel like I learned so much about one, just the arcana, and like getting that insight of that rhythm, because like I had a sense of it, and like that's a part of the intuition, but gaining that understanding, and then also having your share and like getting that perspective of this feminine aspect of seeing like also how you go through a process. And I think this is the important thing too, of how we can understand that you can have any process, and it doesn't necessarily mean whether you're masculine or feminine or whatever the case is, that you have multiple processes for it. And it's all about just kind of identifying these things and identifying that we are these multidimensional beings, and that we function on all of this, on all these levels, but we're also encapsulated in this quadrant, just to simplify it a little bit more. But yeah, thank you guys so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this. There's so much more to come, so much more practicality, so much more practices, insight and experiences that we're going to share with you guys. And yeah, and just wrap up more and more of this masculine and feminine dynamic that we're coming into this age of Aquarius. So thank you, Shaka, as always. Always. We're going to catch you guys on the next one.
If you like this episode and would like to explore more perspectives like this with me, as we get a bit more intimate and intricate look into our internal vibrations, be sure to tune in to next week's episode and subscribe for more. Until then, keep frequently speaking what you frequently see.